My name is Joe Wasserman. Welcome to Peace is Possible. In this program, we discuss issues of war and peace not being talked about in the mainstream media. If the people of the United States stand up as one for peace, peace is possible. Today, I am interviewing Steve Krevisky, chairperson of the Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition, which has hosted 3 conferences on peace issues, 3 annual conferences. He is a longtime peace and justice activist, going back to the Vietnam anti-war movement. He is a participant in many anti-war and solidarity rallies and pickets. He has been part of visits to congressional and legislative offices as well. He is also a professor of mathematics at Middlesex Community College in Middletown, Connecticut since 1985. He is a member of the Executive Board and Delegate Assembly of Congress of Connecticut Community Colleges, otherwise known as the 4 Cs, part of the SEIU. He functions as union secretary, and he is also faculty chapter chair on his campus at Middlesex Community College. Steve, welcome to Peace is Possible.
Joe, thank you for having me, and I know we've got a lot to talk about and many issues that the viewers will hopefully want to be in touch with us about.
Yes. So just to let the audience know, I too am an active member of Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition, which is working for peace and is supportive of other various justice issues. Tell me more about the work of Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition.
Well, thank you, Joe. We formed a few years ago out of our desire to bring different groups together, such as the Climate March people, women's groups, Black Lives Matter, getting more young people involved, and also to get people to think about why should they be on our side in terms of those of us who argue for progressive issues, equality, justice, labor rights, women's rights, Black Lives Matter, etc. And so we've had 3 conferences all on my campus, Middlesex Community College in Middletown, Connecticut. It's central to the state, and we have good facilities there. Our 4th annual conference is coming up Saturday, November 9th, also at Middlesex. And we have a lot of issues that we're concerned about, and it looks like as of now, we are going to get Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, a group that's been involved in a lot of anti-war organizing, to come to speak at our conference. Other speakers yet to be determined. And we've been involved in passing out leaflets at the women's marches at the state capitol in Hartford. We were at the anti-gun rally last winter, and we try to support what other groups are doing, and we hope to forge stronger bonds with other groups and coalitions.
Tell me more about the 3 conferences that Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition has had, and you mentioned the possibility of Medea Benjamin coming to the November 9th conference. Who is Medea Benjamin, and how can you fill me in on the 3 conferences that we've had already?
All right, thank you, Joe. Medea Benjamin is one of the leaders of a national organization called Code Pink. And Code Pink is involved in organizing for peace and justice and labor rights and women's rights. And they often hold vigils and demonstrations down in Washington, D.C. And they send out periodic emails about alerts that people should be paying attention to, such as some of you in the audience have heard about the horrific situation in Yemen. The U.S. is backing Saudi Arabia's war over there that's killing a lot of people and leading to famine and some real damaging things going on. And U.S. corporations are definitely complicit in that situation. So at last year's conference, the third one, we had one speaker to talk about Africa, Maurice Carney, who spoke about the Congo, and a speaker who also talked about Yemen in terms of what's going on, the geopolitics of it, and why we should care about what's going on there, because like you very well put it, Joe, you hardly hear about what's going on, and that some people in Congress are thankfully trying to put a stop to this bad situation. We also had a speaker at a previous conference, Bruce Gagnon, who's up in Maine and who's been involved in many demonstrations over nuclear weapons, and I believe there are bases up in Maine, and so he's been a very prominent activist. In our first conference, we had workshops, which we didn't do last year, and we also have had literature tables. We've had people who pass out literature about, be it Cuba, about women's rights. Clay Cult has a lot of posters, banners, bumper stickers, buttons to sell to people. So we try to get people involved through these conferences, among other things that we've tried to do.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions. One is, tell us about your work with the Congress of Connecticut Community College. And two, how do we connect local work to protect education funding and opportunities with the urgent need to cut the overbloated military budget, which is eating up our resources?
Well, thank you, Joe. Excellent questions on your part. We in the Congress of Connecticut Community Colleges are 4Cs, and we're local of the Service Employees International Union, which is known by the acronym of SEIU. So we advocate for our members, faculty, and professional staff, bargaining in terms of wages, benefits, and pensions and health care are covered through a statewide coalition of unions called CBAC, State Employees Bargaining Coalition. So we've been in a situation where we've had many concession agreements over the years, most of which I voted against because I feel we've given up too much. Because in terms of connecting to other things, in terms of your question, a lot of us feel that the rich and corporations don't pay their fair share of taxes, which is a statewide and also national problem. And so they keep asking for us to give, which hurts our members, especially our new members, because prior to this year, we haven't seen raises in several years, and we're often scapegoated for problems that we didn't cause. And I think we could say that all the money that goes into the military budget, including Connecticut being so heavily militarized, all those billions of dollars takes away from our needs for education, health care, jobs, better climate, better public transportation. If the viewers could visit our campuses and see our working conditions. I have a tiny cubicle that's probably about 1/4 the size of this room, if that. So one of the things that we hope to talk about at our November 9th conference is military conversion, in terms of the military spending creates fewer jobs than non-military spending. So how can we convert this war economy into a peaceful economy so that people who work in General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin or the sub bases down in New London would maintain their benefits but work to produce more peaceable things. So we need a whole change in the paradigm of how this country does things. And I have a concern that education's been corporatized in the last 20 to 30 years. And if I had more time, I could talk about this whole attempt by the Board of Regents to consolidate our 12 community colleges into one college. And a lot of us don't like it very much, to say the least. So I think there's connections to be made between issues when we talk about things like, let's say, money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation. Those kinds of slogans can connect issues which we think we need to do.
Okay, good, thank you. So tell us about the campaign to close military bases around the world.
Well, thank you, Joe. A little over a year and a half ago, a number of us from Connecticut and other places in the United States, and I think a few other countries, attended this conference in Baltimore about closing the bases. And we heard presentations from activists from Ireland, Japan, other countries to talk about a number of things, how the presence of the bases can hurt the local economy. There's been issues about mistreatment of people, like in the Philippines, in terms of women and how others are mistreated who work on the bases. And then, of course, the money that's spent on the bases takes away from human needs at home. And then the bases are also staging points for the wars of intervention, be it in the Middle East or other places that we in the peace movement oppose. And so there was an international conference in Ireland last year to continue this work to close the bases. And there's also something I have in front of me, that the House of Representatives passed an amendment to the so-called National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, introduced by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, requiring that the U.S. military provide Congress with the cost and supposed national security benefits of every military base or foreign military operation. And groups like World Beyond War, of which we're an affiliate, had flooded congressional offices with a demand to pass this. So the bases don't get talked a whole lot about, but because people, hear about bombs being dropped on other countries, and going back to the Vietnam War era, one of the things that turned people against that war was seeing on TV soldiers who'd been killed in Nam coming back in body bags, and people saw that on TV, that some of those people could have been their loved ones, which is one of the things that turned the tide against the Vietnam War. So the bases do need to be addressed, and there was a good representation at that Close the Bases conference, and that activism will continue.
Thank you. Yes, I would tend to agree that we don't need all these bases around the world. It doesn't make the world any more secure, nor help our nation. What is the mainstream media missing in its coverage of the situation with Iran?
Well, I think part of what we're up against in terms of getting people on our side, because we think that opposing war would mean, as you very well put it, Joe, drastically cutting the bloated military budget to meet human needs at home. I mean, we need better subways. In my hometown of New York, the subways have a lot of breakdowns. We mentioned education before. We need much better schools. We need jobs, better health care for people. That's a big one. So I think what seems to be going on is that it's so easy to scapegoat people in other countries, especially people of color. You know, if you think about all these unjust wars that have been fought in our name and with our tax dollars, you know, be it Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, Syria, Iraq, Iran. No great surprise that these are wars against people of color, and that, you know, wars are good for exploiting the resources of people in those countries, cheap labor, high profits for multinational corporations, installing client dictators who are very favorable to those corporate interests. It seems to me that the United States never got over the 1979 overthrow of the Shah of Iran, who was a staunch ally of the United States, whose government was very repressive. And I read many years ago that the CIA trained their counterpart, the Savak in Iran, in methods of torture against activists in Iran. And so I think ever since then, the United States has tried to recoup in Iran. And several years ago, our viewers and listeners may have heard that there was the deal with Iran, going back to the Obama administration, to for Iran to comply with inspections of what they were doing. And it seems to me that there's been an attempt to claim that Iraq and Iran and all these countries are threats to world peace, when none other than Martin Luther King, one of my favorite people, argued that there were the triple pillars of militarism, racism, and poverty, that the ills that befell the United States, and that he spoke up against this kind of militarism while people of color back home here were being denied their rights. And so I think it's a dangerous situation in Iran to, with the U.S. pulling out of the nuclear agreement with Iran, claiming that Iran is fomenting mischief in places where the U.S. is doing that and much more, and that there's a risk of war that could lead even to a nuclear war, which, Joe, you've been very involved in, to your credit, over the years, to stop nuclear war. So we really need to be concerned about the lies and propaganda in the media, like all the claims years ago that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that they were backing Al-Qaeda. Those turned out to be lies. Mm-hmm. And look at all the damage that did. And now we're getting a lot of the same things, scapegoating Iran. And it often seems like the United States is looking to find enemies to go to war with.
Yes, endless war, picking fights around the world. What should we know about the dangers of a nuclear weapon confrontation? What can be done to lessen the danger?
Well, very good question. And Joe, you've been in the thick of organizing against nuclear weapons for many years with the yearly Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemorations. It's not only a matter of the U.S. getting into something in the Middle East, but also India and Pakistan, both nuclear powers, are at odds with each other again. That's an age-old conflict that some of the viewers and listeners may be familiar with. But also something that I'm concerned with is the whole NATO buildup right on Russia's borders, including in a lot of the Eastern European countries who haven't fared so well with the changes of 30 years ago in the rise of fascism, not only here, as many people see it, but also in Eastern Europe itself. And so since the US and Russia are both nuclear powers, it's quite possible that something could trigger a nuclear exchange that could be very dangerous for all of humanity. And now also, of course, the US and China are at odds over trade issues and other kinds of things. And being as many of us see the US as an empire who wants to dominate the world, then, you're right, Joe, in terms of seeking out enemies. There was a book I saw in the 70s by the former CIA station chief in Angola, John Stockwell, wrote a book called In Search of Enemies. And at that time, the U.S. was supporting right-wing rebels in Angola. They were backing apartheid in South Africa and historically blocking liberation struggles such as the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua that inspired so many people, and CIA attempts to assassinate Castro in Cuba. So it is a dangerous situation that if the powers that be, or as Marx used to call the ruling class, saw that it was in their interest to drop a nuclear bomb on somebody, which would be a lot more powerful than what was dropped in Japan, it could lead to a global confrontation. And people have talked to me about, are we facing extinction of humanity because of that? And people ought to be very concerned about that.
Yeah, we're hearing very little about the NATO buildup along the Russian line. That isn't being talked about. And what isn't being talked about in the mainstream media is the development of small-scale nuclear weapons that may be considered usable in a conventional war situation, thus dangerously merging nuclear war and conventional war together. Again, this is stuff that the mainstream media is not talking about. It's important that we oppose these new forms of nuclear weapons that are being developed and not being talked about, and support the Hold the Line, LYNE, resolutions to cut funding for these low-yield nuclear weapons that Senator Murphy has signed on to, but many of us are hoping Senator Blumenthal and John Larson will sign on to them as well. How can people become involved with Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition?
Well, thank you, Joe. I think if people are concerned about all the issues we've been talking about today and how they are interconnected, then I would be happy if people wanted to call me or email me to discuss this further. We have monthly meetings of our Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition. We're meeting this coming Saturday, August 17th, 10 a.m. at Jennifer Brown's Yoga Studio in Middletown, 131 River Road, where we make plans about many upcoming activities, not only the November 9th conference that we mentioned before, but also I wanted to hold this up I have this peace calendar, a 2019 peace calendar, which viewers might find of interest, which helps us to try to connect issues and bring groups together, published by the Syracuse cultural workers who've been active for a long time. I wanted to, in particular, show this page about fighting climate change, which affects a lot of people. There's groups out there like 350 CT that some of our members are involved in. And so I think we need to really be much more organized and mobilized because, as Joe well points out, the mainstream media really isn't covering these things. And then with the recent issue with scapegoating immigrants, separating children from their families, which is abominable, and certain people in Congress who have the guts to say that they are concentration camps. We ought to be very concerned about that. And there's also, among many things going on, that I would encourage people to work with us on. Toward the end of September, there's going to be a big series of events in New York involving Stop the War Machine, and there's going to be a big climate march. One of the culminations of that is that September 22nd, and all of this will be in New York, there'll be a march on the UN, and different groups will converge together, and hopefully our Peace Coalition will endorse that and get involved in that. And Joe, you've talked about, pressuring Connecticut's congressional delegation to see our side of things. Unfortunately, they've been all too quick to support the military budget, even giving Trump more than he wants. And people should be concerned about the tax cuts for the rich that Trump and his minions have supported. And thankfully, there's groups out there like Vets for Peace. They put out a fine newsletter, and some of those people belong to our coalition. So you can come to our meetings. You can join us for the September mobilizations in New York. Come to our peace conference on Saturday, November 9th. And I think some of us have wanted to build stronger ties with the climate movement, women's groups, Black Lives Matter, and church groups, student groups, and there's so much that needs to be done. And I personally would like to see, if it doesn't sound too old-fashioned, a 1960s, 70s series of mass mobilizations that I maintain did change society and did change the culture, and the powers that be have tried to roll that back for the last 40 or more years. And labor has to be involved as well. We're the sleeping giant. And so we need to, I think, be organized, mobilized, create our own media. Also, the New Haven Peace Council people have gotten resolutions passed to the city councils to cut the military budget and meet human needs. And so there's many things we need to be doing, and we'd like to hear your ideas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Good to talk to you and share all this.
Good. Thank you. So please consider joining Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition. You could also reach me at joewass64@yahoo.com or at 860-561-1897. Thank you.